Okay, good. I got about a minute, so we'll wait. Is your wife listening in someplace too?
I think you'll see her in a little bit.
Oh, cool.
We're a multi-screen family.
Yeah, I feel I'm sitting here with three screens. It's like this is why I went to rabbinical school, right? Exactly. Well, we're delighted to welcome all of you back. For those of you who are with us with our first session, we are now resuming with our second, and I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Jonathan Weinberg back. Jonathan is now become a friend of mine. I had only met his father once at a convention in Jerusalem in 1973. That was the one time I remember your dad. Um, I think it was Jerusalem in 73 when he was there for a convention. And I have been not only honored to follow in his footsteps at Emmanuel B'nai Yeshurun, but that also gave me the chance to get to meet you. And that's been quite a treat. Jonathan grew up here for those of you who may have known him when he was younger and had much longer red hair. He graduated from what is today USM and went on to Harvard and has stayed out east ever since. He's a psychiatrist in the Boston area. And after his father's death and his mother's death, he was here for some time going through, along with his sister Myra, his parents' papers, particularly his father's. And he was able then to put together a collection of his father's writings called Becoming Kaddish. I was profoundly moved by this and then asked if he would consider coming back home by Zoom this way and spending some time this afternoon talking to us in a sense about what it means to belong in some way to your parents. Even the choice of the title he gave to the book. You know, we are Kaddishals to our parents, that we then are the ones for whom the obligation rests to say Kaddish. Um, I know my grandfather never let his kids forget that. And I haven't let my kids forget that either. So, anyhow, Jonathan, we are thrilled that you are here. And thank you for joining us. And for your family and friends, wherever they may be, as they're joining us, we're thrilled to have them too. So I'm going to turn this over to you. And we will probably, with your permission, unless you want us not to, I think we have, almost 40 people online now. We can mute everyone for a while, and then when you want us to, or we can take it. I think we're going to mute everybody for a little bit. And when you're ready, we can unmute anyone individually or everybody, as the case may be.
Great. So thank you, Mark, and Shana Tova Good Yontif to everybody. And it really is something to be home in Milwaukee, even though I'm not in Milwaukee, but with you. And I prepared about, maybe 20 minutes of my speech, my words. And then I hope there'll be time, if we want to have some discussion afterwards. And first, I just want to start by thanking Mark for giving me the opportunity to put these thoughts together and to be able to share them with you. So Mark called me and asked me to think about this subject. To whom do we belong? To our parents? To our ancestors who came before us? And what's our responsibility? How do we hold on to the past and bring it into the present? And how do we embody the life of someone that we cherish while we become ourselves? So this is a homecoming of sorts, and I have to say it really is a warm feeling to be here, though odd also in so many ways. And speaking of the past and holding on to it and preserving it, my last real significant to Congregation Emmanuel was in the 1960s, when it was still on Kenwood Boulevard. And I can still call Edgewood 2 6960 and expect to get through, but I don't think I would anymore. I left Milwaukee after high school when I was 18, and that was 50 years ago, exactly at this season, which was really several lifetimes ago. So I was a member of NOFTY, the Northern Federation of Temple Youth. And by the way, if anybody here was a member of NOFTY between the years 1965 and 1980, or you know anyone who was, please get in touch or have them get in touch with me. We have come back together as Nofty and have been having reunions for about the last decade, ironically still referring to ourselves as the Northern Federation of Temple Youth. We're not youth anymore, obviously. And I have dubiously been named the president for life. So to whom do we belong? To our parents? To our ancestors who came before us? What is our responsibility? Before I began to write this, I really did have some notions and ideas and beliefs about these kinds of questions that had become valid for me, but no happily integrated, consistent answers. And after I spent time thinking about this and putting this talk together, I still don't have consistent answers. And one attribute of maturity is the capacity to hold opposing and contradictory truths simultaneously. Now that I can talk about. And I hope that you might recognize and consider your own paradoxes and contradictions. And I also want to interrupt myself for a moment to acknowledge that I wouldn't be here at all with you on this Yom Kippur if it weren't for the COVID-19 virus. I don't want to, and I can't ignore that fact, because we're not in shul. I'm where I live in Lexington, Massachusetts, in my home. We're a screen-connected congregation and have to do our best with it together in our separate places. Like so much of this pandemic, it exposes underlying truths. We can say that we're all in the same boat together, and that's true. But some of us get to travel in first class, and others are trapped in steerage. And if there were an emergency, there aren't enough lifeboats to go around for everybody. And as Jews, that matters, especially at this season of remembrance. We contemplate who we've been, who we are, who we can be. What are we aiming for? What counts? So as Mark was saying, the reason that he reached out to me is because Myra, my sister, and I self-published a book last year of some of our father's writings. Let me hold it up now so I don't get distracted later. This is what it looks like. It's called Being Kaddish, and the picture is an oil painting that my mother painted of my father. It's one of my favorite paintings that she did, and is hanging in my house now. You can get this book, by the way, I hope at the Temple Gift Shop and on Amazon. So this is only one very small aspect of my father's writings, I must say, among a lifelong body of work. He didn't publish much, but there are his sermons, a couple of pamphlets, a couple of chapters. So this talk does have to do with my father, and it's also about me. But if it's not about you in some way, I've missed my mark, because we all come from families and parents, live our own lives, and maybe have children who extend our family line. Some of you may remember my dad. To others, he's just a name in the congregation, like Herbert Friedman or Joseph Barron, who came before him. Short in stature, he was a towering figure in the 1960s and the 1970s during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. He was my rabbi, and he was my father. And I remember in the kitchen when we would talk about the links in the chain of Jewish history and how seriously I took my responsibility at his exhortation to be the next unbreakable link in that chain. I took my responsibility as seriously as possible as I could. And between high school and college, I wanted to have an even more serious immersion in a traditional Jewish life, and spent a summer living in Baltimore in an strict Orthodox Jewish community. Since then and now, so many life changes have happened, I gotta say. I was 24 when my father died. Think about your perspective and understanding about people and their place in the world and how it grows and changes at, say, the age of 50 or 70 compared to 24. At 68, I'm thinking much more closely about mortality, about what I've accomplished in my life. Whom have I made a difference to? What is my legacy? My older brother Avram, rest in peace, contemplated becoming a rabbi, and he became a clinical psychologist. My older sister Myra married a man from Cuba who was Catholic, and they became Sufi Muslims, by the way, which are the Hasidim of Islam. She has been a gentle soul, and believes, by the way, that every human being contains God's essence, that there is one God, and that every religion prays to that one God that we can't comprehend in our human way. She's devoted her life in many ways to kindness and giving. So I was the youngest child in the family, and I also thought about entering the rabbinate. But I really wasn't able to imagine leading a congregation with my really unsettled belief in God. And over the years, I've moved away from being religiously observant. I became a psychiatrist, probably for some of the same reasons that my brother became a psychologist, granted a kind of a secular rabbinate of sorts. Now, in biblical times, God spoke through prophets. Then in rabbinic times, God's word was interpreted through teachers. And my belief is that in our current times, God doesn't speak, isn't interpreted, but is a projection of our human selves. I don't believe in God. When I'm in shul, I have difficulty speaking the words of prayers that are addressed to God in Hebrew or in English. But our history as a Jewish people could not be more important to me, and our Jewish community and culture and all they stand for. My Jewish identity is basic to my core. And now I'm the oldest living male in my family. That makes me the current patriarch. And I think I've lived the longest of any male, going back at least to my grandfather. So who carries a father's legacy? And in what respects? And who gets to make the judgment? Mark asked me to be here because he believes I preserve my father's legacy. Do I? In what ways? And in whose opinion? And if not, what then? Who gets to make the judgment? James Hillman was a therapist. In an introduction to one of his books, he said that Freud's theory grew out of his own experience. So he was a Freudian. Carl Jung was a Jungian. Hillman studied them both and was something of a disciple. He called himself a Hillmanian because his views grew out of who he was. Sheldon Kopp was another therapist. He wrote a book titled, "If You Meet the Buddhist on the Road, Kill Him." It's not a violent title, but what it refers to is that we try to emulate our teachers, our gurus, but at some point, we have to be true to ourselves and strive to be who we are, not them. I did have a recollection that Sheldon Kopp was Jewish, so I looked him up online. I could only find one single sentence of his biography. He was from Brooklyn. He was Jewish, and I'm not making this up. The other thing it said about him in that sentence was that his mother was very disappointed in him. Who gets to determine a legacy? But you must be familiar with the story about Reb Zusia. At his death, God doesn't ask him why he wasn't more like Moses. He asks him why he wasn't more like Zusia. So my children were born long after my dad died. One of the great pains of my life, and this was before I ever had kids, and it's to this day, one of the great pains of my life is that they'll never have any experience personally having known him or any memories of him. I could cry saying that. How do you convey the essence of a person who's no longer here? You have to live with the solitude that you really can't. After my father died, and then even more after my mother died, I came into possession of all of his books and papers and sermons and letters from his college days, from his HUC days, and all the letters that they wrote to one another when he was stationed in the South Pacific during the World War in the 1940s. What do you do with all of that? So I donated a lot to the National Jewish Archives. And I held on to a lot of it too, because I couldn't not keep it close to me. But my children and his other grandchildren who never knew him aren't really going to want very much, if any of it. So when I get to it myself, or after I die, more is going to go to the archives, boxed away for some esoteric scholar studying Reform Judaism from the last century. Dudley never spoke from the Bima, the words that were written in the prayer book that were ordinarily read before reciting the mourner's Kaddish. He would speak meditative words that he composed uniquely each week. In 1976, after he died, I kept close at hand a pile of these meditations. I would share one or two of them when someone I cared about suffered the death of a loved one. Some were spoken at my brother's funeral and at my mother's funeral. I've always felt that they weren't just from him and of him, but that they were timeless and eternal. So Myra and I joined together last year to compile and edit them, and we made them into a book. Each of us, our father's children, saw beauty in his words and knew that they could still bring comfort and solace beyond his lifetime to those in the throes of loss and grief. We titled it Being Kaddish. You'll see why in a moment. Myra, by the way, designed the layout of the book and hand calligraphed the Hebrew Kaddish in it. She then would be Kaddish too. So this is some of what we wrote in the introduction. Those of us who remember his delivery of these soliloquies can yet hear the velvety resonance of his voice, the laden pause, and then he would say, with these thoughts in our minds and our hearts, we speak now the names of some of our departed dear ones, the anniversaries of whose going from this life to the life eternal occurred during this week. And continuing what we wrote, a saeculum, that's S-A-E-C-U-L-U-M, a saeculum is a measure of time. It's the length of time between when an event occurs and the passing of the last person to remember it. The number of those who knew him are dwindling. The memory keepers of his voice and beneficent presence, souls he touched in his life, are passing onward. It's our hope to preserve his words for those whom he affected personally, and for any who might yet find uplifting guidance and consolation within their thoughtful contemplation. We pray that these meditations continue to bring inspiration, comfort, and solace. I'm going to read a couple of these meditations from the book now. Myra and I chose the one I'm going to read first as the title of the book. And if you'd like to close your eyes as I read them, you're welcome to. They may serve as a prelude to the Yizkor service. What is Kaddish? Kaddish is not merely a liturgical formula. We say in our tradition that a person is a Kaddish, not merely that he says a Kaddish. What is Kaddish? Kaddish is the declaration that God is supreme, that his kingdom is real, that we hold the visions of it in the center of our being. Kaddish is the proclamation that God, who is above all our blessings and all our praises, is nevertheless at the heart of our hearts and the soul of our souls, and is the source and the guarantor of all that is good and just and right and beautiful and holy. Kaddish is turning outward to the world in ultimate concern, even when our own hearts are broken inside, and are praying for the peace and the welfare of Israel and mankind. Kaddish is man's determined struggle to make God king in this world, to bring the peace that reigns in his high places into the places of human habitation. And the Jew is asked not simply to say Kaddish, but to be a Kaddish. Memory is like a jewel. It requires a setting that its brilliance may be most beautifully shed on its surroundings. When we remember beloved ones, remember them with gratitude and blessing and kindness. Let our remembering be set in the setting of a life worthy of their memory. Let that life be made pure, Let that life be dedicated to the clearing away of the roughness and the debris that we accumulate in our souls, in our relationships, in our communities. Let it be a setting fit for the love and the truth, the dreams and the hopes we remember when we remember our dear ones. To merely remember is to achieve nothing, but to remember in the midst of life and then make life itself worthy of what we remember, that is to do almost everything. We titled the book Being Kaddish. It will outlive me and Myra. This remnant of Dudley's life will become a remnant of our lives. What will be left of us? In all seriousness, I expect my mark will be on those I've personally shared times and moments with, and I'll be forgotten in 2 generations. My father had a larger presence, if you count the number of people whose lives he touched, and he will also be forgotten. This book may reach and connect beyond his seculum. We need community and continuity and heritage and connection. It's in our DNA. That's what we're about today as we observe Yom Kippur. And for better and worse, we value freedom and independence and choice and mobility. My mother's parents are buried in Cincinnati. My father's parents are buried in St. Louis. My parents are buried there in Milwaukee. I live in Massachusetts. My daughter lives in Florida. My son has yet to finish school, and who knows where he's going to settle. The problem of raising children to be independent is that they become independent. How do we remain connected? How are we to be ourselves and also to honor and preserve our parents and our forebears? At this season, we reflect on the cycle of the years passing. Living a life is like climbing along a path up a mountain, venturing around and around annually at an ever higher perspective with each succession along the route until we reach our final elevation. We remember our loved ones with Kaddish. We honor them with our lives, beginning again with each new year. So may it be for all of us a happy, healthy, love-filled Shana Tova. Thank you. That's it. I wish everybody a good Yontif, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. You're open for people to share with you, right?
Totally,
Yes.
absolutely.
So we're going to allow you all to be unmuted. And please, if you have something you'd like to say or add or ask, please do. I'm just looking to see if I see any hands, either real hands or virtual hands, as the case may be. But I think Andrew's back, and he's better at that than I am.
Having been very close to Rabbi Dudley, I'll take the prerogative of speaking up. As I did at a conference on mental health that was held at the temple, which was a wonderful venue for people in those days. And here's what I said. I ask for a moment of your time in honor of Rabbi Dudley Weinberg of blessed memory, my teacher here at EPJ. Rabbi Dudley's untimely death in 1976 was due to the major depression he suffered after a heart attack, a depression that took his life. He has been with me always, of course, because he set me on my way. He led me into the spiritual life that I have had always from Rabbi Dudley. And we were friends. And he called on me at one time in the big group where we were studying with him on a Shabbos afternoon. And he had told a story as he does, not did, as he does. And after telling the story, he would say, "Oh, but that's just what some people say." It was a mystic teaching. And he called on me before that had ever happened. And I was reluctant to say anything. I didn't know what to answer. But I stood up and he said, "Speak." And I've not ever stopped speaking. I'll stop speaking now. I love you. I'm so proud of you.
Jonathan and Myra, this is Linda Frank, formerly Grossman. I remember the day of my bat mitzvah in 1961, and there weren't, I was sort of in the first wave of when girls were bat mitzvah, and being in your father's study before the service, and his way of, I guess, ensuring that I wouldn't be nervous. He told me that he could take me to Pittsburgh or Ann Arbor, wherever Jonas Salk was. And this was after we had the Salk vaccine. And he talked about all the people who suffered from polio and all sorts of diseases. It's somewhat relevant now. And we'd get on a train and we'd go to, I think it was Pittsburgh then, and meet Jonas Salk and what incredible stuff he had done and the people who had suffered so much from polio and diseases. And I was totally in tears. And my parents were very, very upset with him. How can you do this to her when she's about to go on the bima? And it was like a clearing. I suppose he figured I got it all out. And it was a clearing. And I went up and I read the Torah with confidence. And had he been with me at the time of my son's bar mitzvah, when the tears flowed quite a bit on the bima, I should have somehow figured out how to clear it before, but it was a much more emotional occasion. But it was brilliant, I think, that he sort of drew it out of me, and gave me the confidence, and maybe because I had a polio shot, to feel grateful and being able to have that occasion. I will never forget that.
I'll jump in if I could. Jonathan, thank you very much.
I
was 12, I think, when your father passed, so I really didn't know him. I think it was even younger than that. But I have fond memories of going to synagogue on Kenwood. And one of the things that struck me is you talked about sort of the transcendency of belonging. And you probably have strong memories of Kenwood. And we, since as a congregation, have moved to a new synagogue. And yet that sense of belonging is still there. And it's really striking to me that it really is more about the people that you surround yourself and that who forms the congregation than the physical place. I also have very fond memories of Rabbi Shalman, who I don't know if he was a contemporary of your father's. You probably knew him well. Yeah. And I feel a little bit like I got to enjoy some of the wisdom of that era through Rabbi Shalman. I wish I had enjoyed more through your father.
It really was an era. Back then it was classic, not the classic Reform Judaism that of the previous era, but those group of rabbis were powerful, strong figures. And it's an era that's passed. And it's fitting that the congregation moved to Brown Deer because that's where the population went. And it's a beautiful synagogue. When I go in there, being inside and in nature at the same time has been wonderful as a place to worship. And things change, and that's all part of the dilemma. I admired my dad so much in the talents that he had, whether it was one-on-one counseling. Some of the people who were my contemporaries thought of him as a close friend. And even though he was an intimidating figure in public, and people also knew him speaking to large masses of people. And it's for all of us, if there's things that we admire, how do we be ourselves? Because I didn't grow up with many of the talents he had and had others, and also have grown up in a different era. So Mark's question has been an intriguing question for me, and especially at Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, a time of reflection, is a time to think of who are we in the world and where have we come from and where are we going? So brown deer, it makes sense because my memories are old. It's very strange to think I'm old, but true.
Jim.
So I'm Jim Brodsky, and I'm from Texas. And I've never been to your synagogue, or actually in Milwaukee. But I knew Dudley a little bit because my college roommate named Jonathan Weinberg and I became friends exactly 50 years ago when Jonathan got locked in the bathroom at the Kutz camp, the Jewish camp where we were chairman and co-chairman of an institute and therefore put together as roommates. And as a result of that serendipity, he said, why don't you go to college with me? We'll be roommates. I went, oh, okay. And he's been my best friend for life for 50 years. I've heard wonderful things about Rabbi Berkson from him. And it's such a great pleasure to see you, Mark, and just to see you on video. And I knew Dudley a little bit, but the bigger topic, it seems to me, is not just how the people who have come before us remain in our lives, but also how the people who we hold close to us in our lives every day are incorporated in the ways that we see things and do things. And the people who are beloved to us, both past and present, influence our way of seeing, feeling, experiencing, appreciating, and having views that we would not otherwise have. My dad was a surgeon in the same field as I. And every time I pick up a curette, I think of my dad, the way he held it and the way he did it. And there's a lot of things that my wife says that I say, you know, the way Cindy says this is this, or the way one of my kids says. You think, you know, my son, my daughter say it this way. And so we honor, and to me, and I do believe in God, we honor the Spirit of God by honoring those influences we feel from the people who love us and who we love. And my great appreciation for many things in my life come from the people who are with me now, as well as the ones before. And it's part, as Jonathan said, of that continuum. I'm really happy to see Julie Hankin on here because we were in Nifty together. And happy to see a large Brodsky contingent from Texas participating in your symposium. Thank you for inviting us. And Jonathan, I love you very much.
Well, in the presence of the congregation, since Jim Brodsky, Tex, my close friend, is here, please, everybody wish him a Shechechianu and Mazel Tov for becoming a grandfather for the first time 3 weeks ago, talking about continuity.
I would like to, I can't give you my picture. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Lila, right? Yeah, we
Lila.
can. Lila.
This is Lila Silverberg.
Right.
You know, I have a memory of your father. We had joined the congregation when I was pregnant with my first child, and we've been members all this time. And when my father died, I did not know your father very well. He called me just to give his condolences. And he said something to me that I'd never thought about, and it has never left me. And he was talking about, you know, my father's death. And he said, don't be afraid to cry in front of your children because they will never know that something was lost if you don't cry. And I thought that was so meaningful. It stayed with me all these years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim Karen wanted to get in too. Jim.
at first, some of the things I may say may sound a little scattered, but they actually fit into something I realized that may be worthwhile in the discussion and the subject. And first, Jonathan and I have been friends for umpteen years.
Jim, you taught me the alphabet.
What's that?
You taught me the alphabet.
I don't remember that. Wow. But unfortunately, my family wasn't a member of Emmanuel at the time that most of this takes place, because my parents had been part of the group that had started Congregation Sinai. My father, in very much a reaction to or contradiction of his father's orthodoxy, had become very, very reform, something of the era. But Jonathan and his whole family were neighbors on the same block around the corner from where we lived. And my brothers and I became friends of Jonathan and his brother and sister. And I occasionally had the pleasure of meeting and talking with, throughout the years, with Dudley. And he always struck me, even when I was a kid, as being very thoughtful, kind, and intellectual. And you just sensed this from the beginning. Even when I was a kid, I could sense that. And the story that I'll relate is one that Jonathan may not know. But one time, your parents were over at our house, and I don't remember what precipitated it, and I don't know why we had never asked my dad about it, but there was a big old book that my father had, and it was just stored away, and it was in Hebrew, and its covers were long gone, or at least the front cover. And we showed it to Dudley and asked the rabbi, well, what do you think of this? And his demeanor kind of changed somewhat, and he just kind of almost caressed it and looked at it. And it was a Talmud, but a rather large one. And he explained to us that in communities, probably where, if not my father, his father had grown up, that they would share the Talmud, and one of them might be reading it this way, and another one standing to the side would be, and someone might even be looking at it upside down to share it. And it kind of gave me a little bit of an inkling to my father's side of the family, which I later learned just kind of how Orthodox they had been at one time. And it was just interesting to see the way Rabbi Weinberg kind of looked at it and thought about it, and then told us this story and explained it and gave us this feeling, which is a sense of continuity. And perhaps the lesson is to not necessarily to realize that people are different and you don't have to be the same as your parents, but to realize that with some of their faults as well as their marvelous points, to be inspired by the wonderful aspects of different people, and particularly those in your family and from whom you descend, and to take that forward as an inspiration, both with what you do with your life and also with understanding that of others and the way they look at the world and the way they live, and try to contribute to the community. So that's my thoughts on that. And sometime Jonathan and I will have to get back in touch some more again. It's been a few years, to say the least. And I think last time we talked at any length was after your mother had passed. But so we'll have to arrange to get back in touch more often. Yeah. But hopefully my little story has contributed a little bit to some people's emotional, if not intellectual, understanding of what we're talking about today.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. You know, Stan,
Jonathan, my name is Stanley Holland, and I remember your dad well, and I remember you well. Your dad, I remember, had the capacity to simply get to the heart of a matter. I was chairman of the House, and he understood sympathetically what I had to put up with, especially since the heating system on Kenwood was something less than to be desired. And we kept it going with, I think, Scotch tape and God knows what else was available at that time. Your dad also responded, I remember, from the Bima on the Vietnam War, and took a stand that was so courageous. It's almost unbelievable. But he said, if there's any member of the congregation who has a problem in serving, have them see me. And I remember specifically the advice that he gave me once when I complained. I said, I have a problem. I guess Rabbi, I'm a natural born skeptic. And I said, I question everything. Everything. I said, nothing is beyond my curiosity. I just have to know. And I said, do you think there's any hope for me? He said, Stan, that's what you're supposed to do. I never forgot that. And it's the hallmark for my life. I never lost that curiosity. Thanks to your dad, who put the stamp of approval on it. I thank you.
Thanks for saying that.
My pleasure.
Is your book for sale?
It is. So it should be in the Temple gift shop. I guess should in more than one sense. I think it's there, and you can get it on Amazon.
Okay.
It is in the Temple gift shop.
Thank you.
So in addition to some of Jonathan's friends, his wife is on with us. Hi, Judith. And his sister Myra's with us, and his son Dan is with us too. And any other family? I know I see some of the friends too, but it's just thank you. And when you're a student of somebody, and he is or she is a great teacher, you also become a child to that person. And even though I only met your dad that one time at convention, I have felt he's been a teacher in all kinds of ways. I don't know how many of you know that he had written the first draft to the introduction in Gunter Plaut's Torah. And unfortunately, he died before he'd finished. But much of the work is still his, and Gunter gives credit to it. And I have used that in so many ways. It is so well written that even though, for example, I was able to be taught and had a very different relationship with Herman Schallman and a few others when I got to Chicago, your dad has always felt like a teacher. And even more so when I came here. And so I thank you, all of you, for that. And I really, what I would like to do with your permission is just, we'll unmute everyone so you can talk a little bit before, because we're going to have to, it's 1:15. So in just about 3 minutes, we've got to shut everything down again so we can turn it over for our next speaker. But Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and everybody have a good rest of your fast and a wonderful new year. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Fast.
Yeah.
Gemar Chatima Tova. But we're going to stay on here, and you're welcome to be unmuted just to talk for about 3 minutes. That's about all we've got.